Welcome to Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond with Colette Luckie and Dr. Heather Sanders, where they answer the elusive question, why is cultural competence critical in today's multicultural environment, and what are the measurable outcomes and benefits of sustainable allyship? Ready to become aware of, address, and eventually break our cultural biases? Well, let's get into the show.
Hello and welcome to Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond. I'm Colette Luckie and this is my co-facilitator, and conspirator, Dr. Heather Sanders.
Hello, yes, I'm Dr. Heather and I am so excited to be on this adventure with you. I just have to say that.
Yeah.
This is definitely a full circle moment for me.
Okay.
I was that kid who got talked excessively on every report card.
Okay, we have that in common. Just discovered, yes. I
so
had the
it's paying
same.
off.
Yeah, I think so. It's so funny you said that. It just reminded me. I remember one of my report cards, the teacher said, she's a lovely girl, but she talks a lot, right? So yeah, maybe this is full circle for both of us, that it's finally coming in handy.
Exactly.
Right, yeah. So okay, this is obviously the inaugural episode of Breaking Bias on Broadway and Beyond. I think that we have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
Some wonderful, adventures
Yes.
with clients, relative to taking them on their DEI cultural competence journey. That has been very interesting, educational for me.
Sure.
I've always been interested in the social behavioral aspect of, cultural competence and helping people to be aware of their biases. And I think a lot of that started with me exploring my own bias and where those were. As a native New Yorker, kind of grow up with a lot of regional bias, that spans a lot of things, not just, race, gender, ethnicity, identities.
Yeah.
And, through exploring those, began to just be more aware of other biases that people had about New Yorkers, as
Yes.
well as, me as a woman growing up in the Bronx, me as a professional that's entering the corporate world. I spent time in academia teaching at the university level.
Yeah.
So I think all of these things, and experiences certainly brought me to where I am today. And I know you've had similar journeys.
For sure. I mean, I know we haven't necessarily sort of outlined yet, what the crux of our conversation will be today, but I think you said something that's so important, which is in order to be a practitioner of this work, you have to engage in it.
Yes.
And sort of, engage in an ongoing journey and make a commitment to an ongoing journey
Right.
of identity development, intercultural competence,
Right.
and really accepting that we'll never know it all.
Exactly. And I think, starting that, oftentimes people try to help others before they have helped themselves. And
Yeah.
so that's why for me, it was about really identifying, acknowledging, and exploring my own lived experiences.
Yeah.
That really helped me to see myself and how others saw me.
Right.
And through that, I can say, okay, I understand bias from a personal standpoint, so let me help you discover yours. And as I always say, oftentimes we run into people that say, oh, I don't have any biases, and, I don't have, and I always say, if you don't have a bias, you don't have a heartbeat.
Yeah, you're not
Because,
breathing, you're not
if
alive.
you're raised in particular, in a Western kind of culture, and in particular in the United States, we are inundated with messages that create these biases that are unconscious. I think oftentimes some of them become conscious bias, and you can't help but start acting on those. Your behavior is a reflection of those biases, whether
Yeah.
you know it or not, whether they're intentional or not. And so the first step for me is helping people to understand that. And then when I began to study, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which obviously has its roots in the civil rights, movement. I think even the term, at least diversity, equity, I believe it was I believe his last name was Brown, Griggs Brown or something like that, who actually coined that term. And obviously it's evolved to include inclusion. And so, yeah, I know that's where we feel comfortable, and kind of is the reason that, we created this platform. So,
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I want to go back just a moment to sort of, also provide a little context about how I showed up here and how I
Yes.
show up in the world.
Right.
Because something that you said is so extremely profound. Our experiences really inform, how we engage with ourselves, with others. And our experiences are so deeply rooted in our cultural identity.
Correct.
And it's certainly race is a huge part of that. And race, racism, all things race, anti-blackness, that's my jam.
Right.
But culture is very, very broad. It's
Right.
so much bigger than that. And so
Right.
when you talked about regionality, I grew up in the South. I'm in Nashville, sort of native. I mean, I have my roots in Northeast Ohio, but my formative years were in Nashville. I went to school in Nashville, and it's pretty much still considered the Bible Belt, and grew up in a very religious or very, I would say religious and also religiously oppressive
Right.
background. And you're taught very early who's right and who's wrong, a very binary way of sort of approaching the world and
Right.
seeing people. And of course, with religion, and over the course of this podcast, I'm sure we'll talk about the influence of Christianity.
Of course. Yeah.
In terms of racism and bias. But, the way that we see ourselves, whether it's inferior, superior, the way that we see others, is just informed by so many things. And so when we go out into the world and we're expected to engage, collaborate, create with other people,
Right.
we have to understand the impact of the bias.
Correct.
Because like you said, it can be unintentional,
Right.
but the impact is still the same.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it really doesn't matter, whether it is intentional or not. You're right. The impact is the same. The hurt is the same. What develops after that impact that goes, beyond that particular event or scenario, it builds, right? And
Yeah.
unless you're able to really manage that, it could it could lead to dysfunction.
Absolutely.
On so many levels. And again, that's the personal part. So dealing with bias
Yes.
from a personal standpoint helps one understand someone else's bias.
Yes.
But I think one of the toughest things has been to help others understand their bias, in particular people who are in, that dominant, category, as we talk about, who don't want to believe that they have bias.
Yes.
And that is very difficult, first of all, to acknowledge that, and then to begin to think about, well, how am I going to change that?
Yeah.
Because it really is a change in behavior, which is very difficult, in particular for adults.
Absolutely.
Who have seen themselves a particular way, who have received a message that has formed their impressions and their points of view. And what typically comes from that is, almost like a shame. They feel ashamed. Oftentimes earlier, we would give clients the IAT,
Yes.
right, which is the Harvard,
Implicit
association test.
Yeah.
And how many people have said, when they get their results, this can't be, or this isn't, right? And it's the denial, right, first. So you have to kind of get them beyond the denial to, okay, let's just pretend this is true. And if it is,
Okay. Yeah.
and if it is true, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Right? So how are you going to begin to shift your perspective, shift your behavior, and then continue to shift, continue to evolve? Because if you're, let's say, 30 years old and you've heard a certain message, it's probably going to take you 30 years to kind of,
Absolutely.
reverse that that message and start thinking something differently. And that means that's, self-discipline in terms of sustaining, what you've just learned about yourself.
Right.
And, again, and I always say it's not so much behavior modification, but it's heart transformation.
For sure.
And how do you get people to begin to think about transforming their hearts, right?
Yeah, and I think, that really begins with sort of this acknowledgement that mom and dad, grandma, auntie, uncle were great people. But maybe I didn't always receive great messages at home, right? Because that's our first socialization, is at home. Bobby Harrow has the cycle of socialization that talks about how we're socialized in sort of phases.
Right.
And of course, it begins in the home.
Right.
And then, of course, other institutions that we marry ourselves to, church, schools.
Right.
And then, of course, the media plays a major role in that, right?
Huge.
And so it's sort of this phase that you go through, and there are so many models that talk about identity development, and Negressen's model, which is, sort of the process of becoming Black, right? There are so many models, but I think just to put it plainly, you go through this phase where you have to sort of compartmentalize your upbringing.
Right.
I love my mom, I love my dad, or I love whomever sort of informed how I think about the world, but maybe every message that was taught to me wasn't accurate,
Right.
wasn't rooted in
Truth.
right? That's huge, because, we love to tell ourselves lies about, who we are as a people, a collective, and then who we are individually.
Yeah.
And so it's that.
And that goes back generations,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
They're telling their children that because this is the message they've been told. So it could
Yes.
go back 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. It's just passed down,
Yeah.
to the point, I think, in, politically and socially, no one wants to actually admit that, hey, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was, a slave owner.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
guess what? I probably have some of that DNA flowing through my veins for whatever reason. So there's a lot of things to not want to face and to just say, oh, it doesn't matter today. But it does
Yes,
matter
it
today
really
because we are
does.
still dealing with the ramifications,
Of course.
social injustice, inquality in healthcare, educational deficits,
Economic
injustice.
injustice, yes,
Exactly.
environmental injustice. It just goes on
It's
and
all,
on forever.
It's all over the place, And then when we think about, Broadway, just kind of bringing it to how we ended up here
Yeah.
in this discussion really was the as a result of the George Floyd murder.
Yes.
Which to me was the advent of civil rights 2.0. And looking
Yes.
at different industries that had not diversified. I mean, Broadway has been typically, a white enclave.
Yes.
Right? Totally entrenched in, no one can really get in.
Particularly in the creative and leadership spaces of Broadway.
Right.
For sure.
Yes, absolutely. Because people look on stage and say, oh, yeah, there's diversity on stage, but no one was really looking behind the curtain. Who are
Absolutely.
the stage managers? Who are the choreographers? Who's leading up,
Who are the wig
music?
makers?
Who's the wig
Yes.
makers, the dress makers? Totally like 100% white.
Yeah.
Right. And I think with, the awareness that came from, the Floyd murder, people started looking closely at all industries. I mean, people had nothing else to do but to look.
I was going to say, because, we've
Right.
seen unjust murders, and we've even seen them on video,
Correct,
right? Not
yeah.
just seeing them in
Yeah.
the news or hearing about them on the
Absolutely.
news. We've seen them on video. I think it was the collision of George Floyd and COVID.
Right.
Because you're right, we didn't have anything else to do but
Right.
look at this horrific footage,
Right.
and really start to think about. And I'm speaking on behalf of folks who really haven't thought about it,
Who didn't know.
right? Because I think, as it's two Black women.
Oh, yeah. We were
this
aware
is this is
of everything that
we
happened.
know this is our
Yeah.
life,
Yes.
right? But I think people who never had to think about it before
Mm-hmm.
were sort of faced with undeniable sort of evidence of what
Correct.
the stories we've been telling for
Right.
years, decades,
Yes,
centuries.
centuries,
right?
really, yeah.
So, yeah, it was just this, and COVID was awful, obviously. I mean,
Yeah.
our country alone lost millions of lives.
Right.
So I don't want to sort of take that lightly. Certainly a really trying time for the world.
But there was something good came out of it relative to, I think, being aware.
I think I have to
that,
agree.
I'm sorry?
I think I have to agree. Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, that's what it took. It's unfortunate that's what it took, but that is what it took.
We have this super short memory, though, because now we're at this impasse, which is sort of what inspired us to have this,
Yes.
create this platform where people are now wanting to disengage from DEI.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. Through
And-
legislation,
Yeah.
social pressure, legal pressure. Yeah, there certainly is a retraction,
Yes.
of a lot of that. Back to what in particular, we started out kind of talking about, Broadway and what it was and what it wasn't, and obviously that system itself is built a lot, 90, probably 95, maybe 99% on networking. And so if you don't have
Yes.
representation,
Yeah.
right, then you can't network. If you can't network, you're not going to get the funding. You're not going to have, the creative minds in the room
Yes.
that look different
Yes.
than what, the typical model of, a Broadway person would look like.
Right.
So it's just a trickle down, effect. And then the normal, I'll say normal cultural bias of,
Yeah.
hey, what is a person who is a stage manager? What does that look like? Okay, that's white male. Maybe even white male gay,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Has been, very, very prevalent, in that system. And if you didn't fall into that,
Right.
you did not have any type of opportunity to break into it. Interestingly, one of the things that I heard over and over, as we began to, I'll say, infiltrate, Broadway, was, that person isn't a candidate because they've never worked on Broadway.
They don't have Broadway experience.
They don't have Broadway experience. And my reply was always, well, were any of you all actually birthed on Broadway? Did your mother go into labor?
Right, on
here?
Broadway,
Yeah.
right, on
How did
West
you?
42nd and- yeah.
Exactly. Between 8th and 7th. So unless you can show me documentation that
Right.
you were actually physically born on Broadway,
Yeah.
no one has.
Right.
And I rarely met a person that did not get that opportunity because maybe their uncle
Yes.
was the sound person,
Yes.
or their mother was a dresser, or it was some type of connection. And so that in itself needed to be dismantled.
Absolutely.
And, and I'm really happy that through that awareness, a lot of the producers, executive producers, creative people really began to look internally themselves and say, wow, this is true. How is
Yeah.
it that we've never had, African American or Hispanic or Asian stage manager? And you have all of this talent out there in regional theater,
Yes.
that are doing well. So, okay, we can't find them. Well, you never looked.
Yeah.
Let us help you look.
Yeah, and a lot of them are really sincere
Yeah,
in that type of feedback.
absolutely,
They really
yeah.
mean that. And then for others, I really, truly do believe it's a very convenient excuse.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You don't have Broadway experience. And you're absolutely right. Nobody had Broadway experience when they began their career on Broadway.
Correct.
Yeah, you
Correct.
came from
Yeah.
somewhere.
Right.
So,
Even people who Liza Minnelli, okay, her daughter. Well, Liza, right, had a family that was on Broadway. So, yeah, you still had a connection, right? Those
course.
are NEPO, kind of connections still. So,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Everyone is connected to someone. I mean, I'm really happy, and I'm sure we'll get into, some of the guests that we'll bring on
Yeah.
are some of these Broadway producers and,
Sure.
chief operating officers and, music directors who really began to take a hard look at themselves and a critical look at themselves, through coaching and conversations with us around, the optics of this.
yeah.
It looks really bad, number one, because it's not reflective of society. even though the optics were reflective of the average person who could sit in the audience and buy a $400, mezzanine seat.
Exactly.
Right? So there was that economic. Well, why are we even going to, cater to, a demographic
that doesn't really support
exactly,
theater.
Exactly. But they were also leaving out, there were a lot of middle class, upper class people of color that could buy an entire row. You've just never had them on your mind, right? And hey, what about them? So from an economic standpoint, you've also been losing out because
Absolutely.
diversity does pay off. It's a profitable. It's a profitability margin if you really are looking at it.
Certainly a business case for DEI.
Right.
I mean, if you don't have any other motivation, if you're not interested in, heart transformation, you're not interested in just being a good person, that's okay. If you're interested in making money, research definitely shows that organizations that invest in DEI work certainly see the business impact of that. And so I think
even if it's just goodwill, right? That people begin to see, oh, okay, they've never paid attention to your particular production before. But, now that they see you are really an ally, right, not just a performative participant, but an ally and really trying to develop programs and processes and things that are really sustainable, right, like several of our clients have, okay, they may have called us in to do some initial, awareness, but, our approach has always been, we're not just coming in to do training.
No.
There are a lot of companies that can do that.
Absolutely.
If we come
you can
in.
Go online.
Yeah, you can go online and do some online. You go to chat GPT and do that.
Yeah.
But if you're really interested in, organizational change, culture change, it has to be something beyond. You're just going, we're going to hire assistant stage manager. We're going to. I mean, we've really. Yeah.
And, that's one of the things that I challenge immediately. And it might sound weird to some folks, but when people say our number one goal is to increase diversity, well, slow your roll. Because what type of environment are you bringing those people into? Right? You need to prep your ground first.
Correct.
You need to soften the ground. You need to make sure that when people of color come into the space, they have good experiences.
Yes.
Because if you are bringing folks in, because I'm telling you, we've learned a lot here,
right?
Because a lot of times people will refer to sort of negative statistics related to hiring people of color. Well, they don't stay long. Retention is not good, or things like that. Why isn't retention good? Right. And research, good research will tell you why.
Right. And you can't, first of all, you have to attract them. You can't even attract them because you don't have good history around programs and what happens inside the four walls once people arrive. And
absolutely. So it's really creating an environment where you don't just have difference, which is the D and DEI, diversity. It's just the fact of difference, right? It doesn't allude to any behavior necessarily, except for the fact that there may have been some intention in having some demographically different people in the same space.
Correct, Right. But when it came to the E, the equity or the inclusion, really helping them feel like they belong there. Not over criticizing, over observing. Again, if they haven't dealt with their own cultural bias, then someone's coming in, if they are 2 minutes late, we've seen that. Oh my goodness, that particular person, it's sort of like, it just magnified. Whereas, hey, these other people are consistently 10 minutes late. So why aren't you? So it was things like that where we had to really help people understand and, like you were saying, prep the ground before they arrive, just making sure that there is a fair and equitable process.
Absolutely.
That's in place.